right, good afternoon or good evening, whatever you happen to be watching from today. So, if people have watched the channel for any amount of time, you know that I am a huge fan of the history of the First World War. We've done a series in Verdun, I've done a series in Arras, have a lot of plans for the future. And one of my favorite channels on YouTube and also one of my favorite podcasts involves a gentleman by the name of Dan Hill of the channel Battle Guide. I'm going to just bring this up real quick. Let me share my screen. So, what we are looking at here is the Battle Guide channel. And I'll get into it here in just a second with Dan. But really, what you are looking at with Battle Guide is kind of a map-based look at history. So here we go to Gallipoli. You can see that we're mixing in drone shots and things like that. But then also just has this brilliant way of showing troop movements and explaining the history, looking at Google Maps and things like that. Okay, so Dan not only has Battle Guide on YouTube, but also is the co-host of a podcast called Not So Quiet on the Western Front, which is by far one of my not only a favorite podcast concerning the Great War, but one of my favorite podcasts in general. So we're going to go ahead and bring in our buddy Dan Hill right now. Dan, thank you for carving out some time, and what I know is a busy schedule to chat with us a little bit today.
Yeah, hi JD. Thanks very much. What a great intro, by the way. I'm very kind of you to drop the plug in the first 60 seconds. Really appreciate that. So yeah, no, listen, pleasure as always. You and I have spoken for quite a while now, and I think we've got a shared passion for the Great War. And asked me to come on and talk about First World War history. It's a no-brainer. So very happy to be here, and get stuck into a few of the old myths.
Yes, yeah, we're going to tackle a couple annoying myths from World War I that just refuse to die. That you guys have kind of addressed quite a bit on your podcast. Before we get into that, though, if you wouldn't mind, for people who may not be familiar with your channel, what's the background behind Battle Guide? How did it get started?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, so it actually started, I suppose, like a lot of things online, started during COVID. So I, amongst other things, one of my kind of annual jobs, if you like, but very seasonal, is as a battlefield guide. And, pre-COVID, I was taking groups out to battlefields across Europe, talking about, some of the amazing history to be found there. And then, of course, COVID comes along, and all of a sudden, that's just not possible anymore. So me and a group of colleagues who are also kind of in the same situation, thinking, well, how are we going to share our enthusiasm for the subject? How are we going to kind of keep going during this tough time? We came up with the idea of trying to use, if we could, new technology to kind of blend the experience of being on a battlefield without actually having to be on a battlefield, which was a tricky thing to do. And there was a lot of wrong turns and learning curves and all that kind of thing along the way. But we ended up creating a series of virtual battlefield tours that we would run live, a bit like this, on a Sunday evening. And it's been a couple of years now since we've done them. So it's a bit of a novelty for me coming back live and doing one of these with you, because it's been a little while since I've done a live stream. But the general concept, the general principle behind it was, if we can't take people to battlefields, why don't we try and bring battlefields to them? And throughout that time, Battle Guide kind of evolved. And as COVID came to a close, we realized that actually, not necessarily me, but certainly the guys that do the editing have picked up a really strong skill set. And we thought, well, why don't we try and put this into more traditional YouTube free to view docs? And, what you're kindly showing just there at the moment is really the end product of that.
Yeah, it's brilliant stuff. If I'm being just honest here, it's annoyingly good to me, because I look at the videos and I'm like, dadgummit, I wish I would have thought of this first, and because it's so good. But it's been super helpful to me. Like, I don't know if I'm, again, just being honest here. I've watched a lot of your videos before I've gone out on the battlefields, and it's helped to kind of be a primer for me, and to help me get a little bit of a foundation of the history before I go out. It's really, really good stuff.
That's really kind of you to say, and in return, we look up to your stuff as well. So don't feel that it's a one-way street. But what you said there is actually really interesting. I think that's really the whole concept behind what we do. It's the idea is if somebody was going to go to a battlefield, and you've got 20 minutes to not only tell them, what there is there in terms of the historical story, but also point out a few key bits where you can go and kind of see the ground. Watch that, and hopefully that will give you a good baseline for going out and do that. So, it's exactly the kind of concept that we pitched at, really. So I'm really glad that it's being used that way.
Yeah, no, it's great stuff. And here, let me just kind of go back here. If you look, I know that our topic today that we're discussing is the First World War, but I mean, here we have, stuff on the Anglo-Zulu War. There's stuff on the Second World War. Like, you guys really cover a broad range of topics. And here you can see the red lines. You can see where I've watched a bunch of them. So I'm definitely a fan of the channel. Now, when did Not So Quiet on the Western Front kick up?
It's a great question. I think my co-host, Dr. Spencer Jones, is much better at these dates than me, but I think we're episode about 78 now. I think we've released about 75. We're probably 3 ahead, and they're weekly. So coming up for a year and a half ago now. So it's pretty well established, actually. It's great fun is the real main thing behind it. It's really fun to make from our side. It's not a huge amount of effort like the videos are in terms of the technical aspect. It's really a bit like you and I. It's just two guys that love history sitting down and talking about it.
Yeah, and I like how it's kind of topical in nature. So in one episode, it'll be like, okay, we're talking about trenches. Okay, another episode, we're talking about machine guns, or we're talking, it's really, really good at taking just kind of a particular topic and really doing a deep dive in it. It's really helped me to kind of broaden my understanding of the First World War. Really good stuff. So with that, I can't think of anyone better to have on the channel here and talk about some of these enduring myths of the First World War that just refuse to die. And I'll tell you what, we're going to go through these, and then I see some super chats and some questions popping up on the side already. So if you have any questions, we'll maybe tackle those at the end. Is that okay, Dan?
Yeah, go for it. However you want to do it. More than happy.
Okay. All right. So let's take a look at this first one. That the trenches on the Western Front never moved throughout the war.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting one. And I think if, maybe generalizing here, and in fact, I should caveat all of this by saying some of these myths are not exclusively not myths, and some of them have a little bit associated to them. The truth is kind of the word that we tend to throw about in the podcast quite regularly. It's complicated. In general sense, at least, there is I think if you were to tap somebody on the shoulder on the street somewhere who didn't necessarily have an interest in the First War and say, give me a 10-second rundown of what happens, chances are they'll talk about a couple of trenches with no man's land in the middle and not much movement going on throughout the war.
Yeah.
The truth is that's not the truth. It's way more complex than that. And I kind of feel, and I don't know whether you're with me on this, JD, but I kind of feel like the First World War gets a little bit of a raw deal sometimes in that it's seen as a very one-dimensional subject, and it's not got the kind of sexy tanks and fast aircraft of the Second World War. But it's got way more than that. And that's the really exciting thing about it.
Yeah, you kind of took the words out of my mouth there, because I was getting ready to address that I think this conflict is deeply misunderstood and comes from, like, I think some of that understanding comes from some what I would consider good sources too. I remember watching a show on History Channel about the First World War, and in their promo they have all these scholars going up and they're saying it was dumb, it was stupid, they were doing this, it was a slaughter, it was this, it was that, and really kind of again reinforcing that really one-dimensional look at the First World War.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. And when coming back to this idea of trenches, it in a way, a lot of people would summarize it like that. Look, there's a trench, there's an enemy trench, and there's a bit of ground in the middle, and one guy has to get from A to B. And there's some truth behind that, what we refer to as the race to the parapet.
Mhm.
But of course, the most obvious truth is when everybody gets there in 1914, there are no trenches.
Yeah.
You know, for the first few months, there's absolute open warfare, free movement, and all of this kind of thing. And it's actually that experience that really dictates the middle part of the war, which is what we consider typically as trench warfare. And it's quite simply that technology has outstripped tactics at that point. You've now got machine guns, which are very effective. You've
Mhm.
got, in particular, devastating artillery. Even in 1914, quite simply, you can't walk across a field anymore and expect to live at the other end of it if somebody's pointing a machine gun and a couple of artillery pieces at you. And the end result is that people have to take cover. And the best way to do that is to develop trenches. I mean, we're seeing this in other parts of the world right now.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely on the Ukrainian front.
Mm.
It's kind of a weird blend of circling back to some shadows of the First World War, but like with drones, where again we have kind of a new form of technology that has driven both sides down into trenches. It's been an interesting thing to watch develop.
That's the thing, you know, and people are rediscovering the art of laying out barbed wire pickets that they were doing in 1914. And, you know, somebody's got to be the one to figure out, well, what's the best system that we can use and how can we combine this with trenches to stop enemy soldiers getting into it and so on and so forth. And the same argument was made at the end of 1914 when we got this fairly well-known concept called the race to the sea, where you get this kind of series of continual northward movements to try and hook around each other's army's flank, which eventually ends up with a 440-mile set of trenches running, of course, from the English Channel right down to the border of Switzerland. And that then really settles in for at least a period of time whilst we have this this prospect, I think, of both sides trying to figure out what's the best way to break through the enemy line. And unfortunately, you know, the way that it's got to be done by 1914-15 tactics is you have to send a guy, you know, over the top to try and get through. There is no flank to go around. You know, if you go a few miles north, you're just hitting somebody else's front. So there has to be somebody somewhere crossing no man's land. And all too often, far too often, it's just a devastating prospect.
So in the whole span of the history of the war on the Western Front, where are some elements where we kind of start seeing that war of movement? So there's the beginning of the war during the initial push, where the Germans, you know, are making their drive on Paris.
Mm-hmm.
Where else do we see kind of that war of movement that we would maybe more associate with the Second World War come into play?
Sure. So, I mean, there's really a couple of points to mention here. So, the 15 to 17, you could say is fairly static. But even then, there's constant evolution. Trench lines are kind of moving, ebbing and flowing as the battle does. And in some cases, you know, over 5, 6, 7, 8 miles, which in itself is a significant movement.
Mm-hmm.
Trenches then have to get redug, lines have to get reoccupied, move forward, move back. But then we get to 1918, and particularly the kind of key date that first sees the end of trench war, kind of spells the doom of trench warfare in a sense, is the 21st of March 1918, which is the opening day of the German spring offensive. By that point, the Eastern Front has closed down, and something like 750,000 to 1 million German soldiers no longer have to fight what was the Russian Empire, then the Soviets. They're going to now flood westwards towards the Western Front, at the same time that your great country has joined the war and is preparing to come over in numbers that the Germans are never going to be able to beat. By the time the AEF gets there in big enough numbers, the war is going to be lost. There's no two ways about it. So the Germans on the 21st of March basically roll the dice with one big push, and they say, okay, before the Americans get here, and whilst the British and French are tired, we've got a manpower surplus. We're going to smash directly through in a couple of key places. And in the course of 7, 8 days, we see dozens of miles of trench lines broken in, broken through, and German troops in the open flooding westwards towards the coast. It's a really big moment that sees new tactics develop, artillery in particular being extremely strong, and just a huge break in trench warfare. And the trenches are going to move massively during that time.
Did the Americans ever really see that trench warfare that the British and the French saw?
Not in the same way. They do see trench warfare in the sense that when they arrive, certainly, I mean, there were troops during the spring offensive. There were American troops on the ground just before it, not big numbers. But also when, for example, the Marines go into Belleau Wood, there are trenches dug in those locations. There are trenches dug on the banks of the River Marne for the Rock of the Marne episode with the 3rd Infantry Division. There are trenches on the start line of the Meuse Argonne and in the Saint-Mihiel salient as well. So they do see it, but it's not that very attritional bit of fighting that we tend to characterize with the British Army, but perhaps more so we should do with the French Army, because it's the French that do the brunt of the fighting and dying, it's got to be said, on the Western Front.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, let's move on to the next one, and this is a big one. Lions led by donkeys. That the generals were just bloodthirsty idiots that were throwing men into the meat grinder.
Right. That was a catchy phrase, right?
Yes.
It works.
It sounds
Lions,
good.
Lions led by donkey. It's actually coined, I think, in the late 1950s.
Oh,
so
wow.
It's not a phrase that's used by Great War veterans either during the Great War or after the Great War. It's actually, I think, an Australian author that coins the phrase in the 50s, or it might be 60s.
Interesting.
So there are variations of it that are used, but it just sticks, and so we use it. And you can understand why that concept works. The scale of death and loss on the Western Front is just so much, so great that, at the end of the war, someone's mother has got to turn around and say, okay, who's to blame for my boy or my 2 boys or my 3 who are not coming home? And, you've got to look at it that way and say, well, somewhere there must be blame. And typically blame's got to go up. And, when you talk about the first day of the Battle of the Somme, which if there is a Lions Led by Donkeys episode, that's going to be it. 19,240 guys killed in a 24-hour period. Someone's got to pay for that. Someone's got to account for those losses. And so there are thoughts that, yep, these generals are the guys. These are the ones that were pushing the chess pieces around on the board. Therefore, they're responsible. But in a sense, JD, I feel like it's more convenient to do that rather than to look at the nuance of the story. Because the truth is, these generals, the last thing they want, and we can just look at this with a bit of logic, the last thing you want as a general is to get 90% of your men killed.
That's not a good way to win a war.
Right. Absolutely. And the thing is, generals don't materialize out of nowhere either. A general is there because he was a good colonel, he was a promising major, and he was a decent captain, and he was a lieutenant who 20 years before was leading men over the top, not ordering them over.
Yeah, one thing.
So go ahead. So it's just interesting that, sometimes we see generals as a transplanted, very distant figure. This whole idea of chateau generals drinking wine 10 miles behind the line. There's an element of that, but when you really dig down into the story, actually it's way more interesting. If you take, for example, a divisional general, a major general, 2-star, he's got a divisional frontage of about 12,000 yards, give or take, for his 12 battalions of 1,000 men each. He needs to know what's going on in the left-hand platoon of his left-hand company, of his left-hand battalion, at the same time as he needs to know what's going on in his right-hand platoon of his right-hand company, his right-hand battalion, at the same time. It's got to be at a central point, which typically is 2 or 3 miles behind the front lines, in a large building with a big communications infrastructure, ideally landlines. And it just so happens that chateaus, large mansion houses, post offices, schools are ideal for that. And so he's in the right place at the right time. These leaders, I like to use an analogy. It's a little flippant for the subject, but I hope it makes sense. It's like going into Apple and expecting the CEO of Apple to sell you your iPhone at the checkout.
Exactly.
It's not his job.
There's this romantic idea of like the generals leading from the front.
Right.
But like you said, if you're a general from a leadership perspective, that's actually bad leadership. Right. I think it's good to be connected. You don't want to be too detached from what's going on. But again, if you are leading from the front, quote unquote, you have no idea what's going. Like things could be completely falling apart a couple miles down the line that need your attention. And what are you doing? You're up front. That's somebody else's job to be up front.
Couldn't agree more. The captains and the majors and the lieutenants that are out on the line, these are the eyes and ears of the senior officers. They're the guys that are collecting the information. If you put, a divisional commander in a single platoon on the right-hand part of the line, in the front line, one, he's detached from everything else that's going on around him. Secondly, his value is significantly reduced. All of
Yeah.
the 20 years of experience he's got in learning how to command men in the field is absolutely useless in that scenario.
Yeah. And I, a lot of when you really kind of get to digging into it, there are a lot of these generals that are in harm's way as well. Arthur Curry is one that comes to mind. There were stories of him getting like probably a little too close to the front, and being in a place where he shouldn't have been. If your top guy who knows everything gets taken out, well, what good are you?
Right. There's
To
a
the
massive
army.
cascade effect as well, because if your general, if your divisional commander or brigade commander gets killed, the whole infrastructure of your division or your brigade then has to get swapped around. And it does happen. There's really weird statistic that I think quite often we don't give credit for. You're almost as likely as a general to be killed as you are as a private in the British Army in the First World
Really,
War. Almost as likely. Artillery, snipers in particular, you're a big target. If you're
yeah,
anywhere near someone that can fire anything at you, they're going to try it. So, most deadly rank to hold, I think, is captain from memory. Then it's lieutenant, and then private and general are about the same level of casualty rate, proportionately, of course.
interesting. So the Australian who coined that term "lions led by donkeys" was this a historian, or was it a veteran of the
Yeah,
First World War?
a historian. I think Christopher Clark, but I could be maybe some of the guys listening in can confirm that.
Okay.
Pretty sure it's Christopher Clark, Australian historian in the 50s or 60s.
Yeah, because on the flip side, I can understand if I was a private who was on the front line and I'm living in this filth, and I just watched, half of my regiment get wiped out. If that's all that I see, if I've got blinders on and I can only see what's in front of me, and what's in front of me is an absolute disaster,
Mm.
I can empathize with that individual and saying, man, all these brave men just got killed. That was a stupid decision. But again, like you said, if you're in the general's position, you're it's counterproductive to willingly throw your men into a situation where they're going to get wiped out.
Yeah. I think logic quite often goes out the window when we look at the First World War. In that, if you look at it from a logical point of view, a general's most valuable resource are the men around him, and they're a finite one. You can't just go throwing them away. The really tragic part of it is, something's got to be done. Bear in mind, Germany has invaded, captured 90% of Belgium and a big chunk of northern France in the First World War, and then have basically sat down on their gains and said, well, we're happy to stay here. If you want us to leave, you've got to make us. And so the onus and the need to attack falls to the Western Allies. Belgium is desperate to get 90% of its country back.
Yeah.
France is desperate to get its massive industrial region, and it's an allied effort. And so they say, well, we've got to push forwards. And then you lose all of the advantages that a defender has. The Germans get to pick the best ground, all of that kind of thing. And quite simply, until 1918, really, to make any kind of movement forwards, any kind of progress, you simply have to go over the top. And, it's men against machine guns in many cases.
That's another point that I try to bring up to people when they kind of perpetuate this myth. I'll ask them, okay, it's 1916. With the technology that they have and with the situation on the ground, what would you do different? And you already kind of alluded to it. They say, oh, well, I would flank them. I would go around. Brilliant. Yes, I agree. Let's do that. Where is the flank? You have a front that goes from the English Channel to the Switzerland.
Yeah.
Show me where you're going to go around. So yeah, I think these men were doing the best that they could with the cards that they were dealt with at the time.
Absolutely. I think the analogy you mentioned there, the cards thing, is actually pretty bang on. And quite often I'll use this on the battlefields. Again, I hope it doesn't come across as flippant to viewers, but it's a little bit like a poker game. Each of you has got a hand of cards, and you need to figure out if your hand beats the opponent's hand. And that it might be that they change. Maybe you've got a new tactic. Maybe you've got a new piece of technology, but you have to put chips on the table to find out.
Yeah.
Sometimes you bet big and you win big. Sometimes you bet big and you lose big. It's just the way that this kind of thing goes. It's tragic because, of course, those chips are lives.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so kind of in that same vein, the tactics in World War One never changed.
Yeah, I think an interesting one. I know you're very well read on the subject, and I know loads of the guys listening in are. I mean, the truth is the tactics changed an extraordinary amount during the Great War. 1914, if you were to look at the German invasion into Belgium and their advance towards Mons and various locations up in Belgium, you see things that you would read out of a Napoleonic rule book. You've got men marching side by side in close formation sometimes with battle standards flying. You're only going to do that once against a machine gun.
Yeah.
You're not going to do it, and it won't be the same guys doing it the next time because they're not going to be there. So, immediately things need to change. And actually, it's this terrible casualty rate that really drives development in the Great War. And it's a tit for tat. Somebody comes up with a new bit of kit, and then you come up with a new way to beat that bit of kit, and it drives innovation. And we see a staggering amount of innovation on the Western Front.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say a soldier gets knocked in the head and it goes into a coma in September of 1914 and then wakes up in March of 1918. How does the war look different to him?
Totally different. The guy in 1914 would relate more to 1814 than he would to 1918. And the guy in 1918 would relate more to 1940 than he would to 1914. It's incredible when you think about it. So much has changed. And there's one spot actually on the Western. I don't know if you've been there. In fact, I think you have, JD. Out in Mons, a place called Saint Symphorien Cemetery.
I haven't been there.
Have you not? Oh, amazing spot. So there are two graves, and they're about 5 meters apart. One is a guy called John Parr, who was killed on the 22nd or maybe 23rd of August 1914, the first British soldier killed on the Western Front. And directly opposite him in the same cemetery, by pure coincidence, is the last guy to be killed on the 11th of November, George Ellison, at 10:58. Those two guys wore the same color uniform. They both marched under the British flag. But if you were to try and tell John Parr about some of the new things that had developed by 1918, he wouldn't have a clue what you're talking about.
Yeah.
You could mention the word tank, he'd have no idea. You mention flamethrowers or poison gas. You mention armored cars. You mention the fact there's hardly any cavalry on the battlefield. You mentioned that there's this thing called an aircraft, and there are 22,000 of them buzzing around the world just in the British hands alone by the end of the war. There are 48 that go to war in 1914. Everything has changed exponentially.
Yeah. One tactic that comes to mind that I was thinking of when you sent me this list of myths and talking about tactics and stuff like that was just the artillery barrages. Even the way that they do artillery barrages kind of changes and modifies mid-war, where they kind of start developing the rolling artillery barrage. Can you kind of explain that evolution, what was going on there?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, my co-podcast host, Spencer Jones, who's the official historian for the Royal Artillery, would have loved that question. I'll try and kind of work my way through it in a very basic kind of way.
Sure.
But in effect, what happens is, in an effort to try and stop these guys, we try and provide cover to these guys as they're going over the top. One method is to just hammer the opponent's front line so that they can't emerge from cover and start shooting at your guys to the very last moment. And then either use a jumping barrage, so jump from trench to trench to then suppress the reserve or support positions, or what becomes more convenient later is a rolling barrage. So quite literally a wave of shells that sweeps in front of your troops as they advance across no man's land and basically clears the way so that at the very last second you can push forward. But they get so complex, these. You end up with multiple waves of barrages rolling at different speeds, at different tempos, reversing and rolling back across the trenches and rolling forwards across them again by 1918 in massive scale and quantity that you would never even dream of in 1914.
Yeah. I've read accounts of guys talking about how as they're following this barrage, like in some cases, the barrage is only 50 to 75 yards ahead of them.
Yeah.
And they're kind of marching forward like they're going into a snowstorm or something. And it's wild to think about. But yeah, this isn't a war where it's just a bunch of idiots that are going in. They're they're adapting and changing tactics and things like that. It's one of the things that makes it a fascinating study for me.
And even as you mentioned there about the artillery, even like the minute details in the artillery actually make a really big difference. So the quality of metallurgy, which allows better barrels to be made in the First World War, and the trigonometry behind the science of firing guns, where you understand things like atmospheric conditions, barrel wear, all of that kind of stuff, that all really plays in a strong way into this idea of barrages. Because you imagine in 1914, if you try and follow a barrage and your guns are not uniformly accurate, your guys are not going to want to get near them because they're going to get hit by their own shells, and as a result they have to fall further back, and then you get these gaps, which is where the enemy can get stuck in. By 1918, we understand that the art of gunnery so well that the leading infantry have the confidence to get within 30 yards and know that they're still not going to get hit. As a result, you see big advances. It's crazy how that happens.
Yeah, wild to think about. All right, let's take a look at another one. And again, okay, this is all flowing just perfect. So there was no development in World War I. That basically they jumped into the trenches in late 1914, and then it just slugging it out in the mud with no changes up until then.
Yeah. I mean, for this one, I guess you can take your pick. You've got a picture of a tank up there, and that's obviously a good one. The one that I like to, I've already mentioned the numbers, but they're so shocking. I like to use that one just to lead us into it, and that's aircraft. Lighter than aircraft have been around. Zeppelins and Shetland airships have been around for about 30 years. But by the time the First World War comes along, aircraft themselves are 11 years old. The Wright brothers' first 12-second flight was in 1903. By 1914, you've got aircraft which are now 48 of them, albeit go over to France with a Royal Flying Corps at that time. 22,000 of them are going to be in service by the end of the war.
Wow!
But those 22,000 are far superior to anything that would have been seen in the skies in 1914, because development has just driven that. It's this idea of, and I love the kind of analogy of it. If somebody if you and I going up into the sky one day, and I'm in a German aircraft and you're in a British one, our jobs in 1914 are to scout enemy positions. We might wave at each other at first, until somebody at some point comes along and says, actually, that guy JD over there who's scouting over my positions and spotting for artillery, I don't want him to do that anymore, so I'm going to get my observer to carry a pistol with him. And the next time your observer comes up with a shotgun, and then somebody bolts a machine gun to the back of the aircraft. And then somebody works out how to fire a machine gun through a spinning propeller with an interrupter gear, which means you can lose the guy in the back, you can make your aircraft faster, the pilot can fire at the same time. All of a sudden, you get fighter aircraft born. And this development is seen in every facet, every single corner of the story of the First World War.
Do you know if there had been any experimentation with aerial combat prior to the First World War? Had anybody messed with, putting a machine gun on a plane, or was this kind of a necessity as the mother of invention situation?
Good question. I don't know for sure, but I'm gonna guess yes. I know airships had defensive machine guns really at the start of the war.
Okay.
So there's somebody had thought about that, and I'd be amazed if in 1912, 1913, although aircraft are designed for scouting, somebody hadn't thought, well, the other guys probably quite like to shoot this thing down. So at that point, though, it would have been rear seat people firing backwards. This idea of shooting through a spinning propeller was extremely deadly, usually for the guy flying the aircraft. The first guy to create it actually is best known as the guy that a tennis tournament is named after. It's a French guy who came up with something called the deflector gear. His name was Roland Garros, and the French Open's named after him today. So he was one of the pioneers in that. Yeah, it's quite a unique little story.
I'll be dead gum. You were talking about the airships or the Zeppelins. I remember an episode that you all did specifically on Zeppelins. And one thing that I found fascinating was how they armed those things. And a lot of people may not be familiar with just how a Zeppelin is constructed, that they think it's a big giant balloon that goes up in the sky. How did they rig those things up for combat?
Well, I mean, in general principle, it is as you described. It's a big giant balloon that goes up in the air, but it's a lot more complex when you look at the insides of it. So a Zeppelin is a lighter than air aircraft, and it's filled with hydrogen bags, so about 19 of them inside a 200-yard long envelope, like that kind of dome shaped thing that we see.
Yeah.
And the idea is they've got a way longer endurance than any aircraft at the time. They can go for days, literally,
Oh,
because
wow.
they've got a couple of engines and you just push them along. If the wind's favorable, you can go very, very long distances. So Eastern Germany over to Britain in 1915, that's not impossible at all. So it's a big thing. And if you can get over there and you've got enough room, for example, for passengers, you can swap those passengers for bombs and you can fly over. It's very unscientific at first, but you can get over East London, for example, where there's lots of industrial targets. And for the very first time, we see the war brought to the British people in a way that it never had been before. Britain's got a fairly unique story in being an island nation, in that our civilian population tend to be isolated from whatever's going on, regardless of where it's happening. Whereas the French and Belgians, people are digging trenches in their backyards, and it's got a very different, very raw feel. But this levels the playing field in a little way, and Zeppelins can bring terror to Britain in that sense, and that's a big thing at the time.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong. I seem to remember from that episode, you guys saying that they actually rigged up machine gun positions on top of the Zeppelin.
Yeah.
Which was surprising to me because I didn't know that was possible.
Definitely the worst position to have on the whole airship. So crews are like usually between about 18 and 25, something like that. If you imagine this airship, what you have is like a set of iron ladders that runs directly through the envelope in between the gas bags. So you can leave the gondola that's kind of slung underneath the airship. You can climb through the body of it and you can emerge on the roof where there's almost a sandbagged machine gun position.
Except so wild to think about.
10,000 feet with no oxygen at that time, freezing cold, sitting up there for a few hours was a really grim task for most of those guys.
So this kind of gets into another thing that I have admiration for, and enjoy is a weird word to say, but enjoy studying with the First World War, is just how tough and gritty these men were. When you look, of course we know about the conditions in the trenches and what they had to go through there, but just something like that, being at 10,000 feet with, no oxygen and freezing cold in a sandbag bunker on top of an airship. It's so wild.
Yeah. Just made of different stuff, right? But the thing is, at the same time, JD, it's a tough world back then.
Yeah.
It's a brutal world. Infant mortality in Britain in 1900 is about 1 in 5.
Oh my gosh.
People have experienced death on a personal level at that point. Average life expectancy is way lower. People are working in really tough conditions, and it's true all over Europe and even in the US. It's been a tough, grim life for most people, even by the time they reach 18. And Spencer and I on the podcast quite often talk about this, and the idea of boy soldiers, and it's a powerful one. The idea of underage soldiers going away to fight. We talk about 16-year-olds going and fighting, which is not uncommon at all. I think what sometimes fails to translate a little bit is a 16-year-old in 1914 or 1915 is not really a 16-year-old in the sense that we see 16-year-olds today.
Yeah,
they've been working, they've been out in the world of work, they're going into pubs, they're many of them have children by that age. They've certainly had a very tough life, and so they're much more mature in that sense. And it's, I don't know, it's a strange one to look at. To look at anything like you and I both do. Trying to understand a 110-year-old war with today's eyes is always tricky.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's move on to the next one. Western Front is a meat grinder that kills nearly everyone involved.
Yeah, that's it's an interesting one. Again, I'm super lucky to take groups out to battlefields, and it's always a powerful experience. And one question that inevitably gets asked when you're standing in a cemetery surrounded by a sea of headstones is, did anybody survive? How many people came home? And those numbers themselves, actually, when you look into it, are really quite stunning. because, you know, the casualty toll in the First World War is astronomical, but it doesn't mean that everybody dies. In fact, if you wore a British Army uniform in any way, it could be in the Army Service Corps, could be in the infantry, could be in the artillery, you have an 89% chance of coming home at the end of the war.
Wow.
It's a real stunner, that, you know. So, you know, standing in a cemetery full of those thousands of headstone, and you hear this and you hear it in absolute good faith. And I'm sure I've said it myself before. You say, you know, my grandfather came home. He was a lucky one of the lucky ones. In reality, that's got to be turned. It is 100%. It's true, and certainly they don't always come home in the same way they go out there. In many cases, they completely change from what they were before. But the reality is, you know, he's in the larger body, those that do survive the war, rather than the smaller one of those that don't.
Absolutely. Okay, now you sent me 5 myths to tackle, and I'm going to throw a 6th one at you here. And this is one that, at least in the United States, has really taken root. I don't know if it has in Britain or not, but the French were poor soldiers in both world wars, and they got invaded twice, and were just not made of hardy stock. What would you have to say to this?
Well, I guess you and I are on the same page on this one. Totally untrue. The French, and I think disagreeably so, because the truth is the French are the ones that fight hardest, longest, lose most people in the First World War than any of the other Allied nations. They do it in their own backyard, fighting for their own lives and homes. And, you know, they pay an extraordinarily high price for it. And they do a damn good job as well. So, yeah, I mean, I'm with you in terms of the idea of, you know, this, it's a cheap kind of throwaway thing. And I can understand sometimes it's done in a lighthearted way. I don't find it particularly lighthearted when I'm standing in a French cemetery in the First World War battlefields.
Yeah.
You know, if somebody was to then come out with this kind of surrender idea, it's a load of rubbish. The French at any given time hold 70% of the entire Western Front.
Oh, wow.
I'm a proud Brit. I've got a great grandfather who's killed on the Western Front in 1917, so it's personal to me. But I need to acknowledge, from that point of view, Britain is not the big player in the First World War. The French are. It's the French that pay most, and the French that fight extraordinarily hard. And you can imagine too, for their own country. You know, if the war was fought in northeastern United States, those guys up there will be fighting damn hard for it as well.
Yeah, it's interesting when you travel to France. Nearly every single village, it doesn't matter the size of it. If you go to the town square, there's always a memorial right there in the middle with a bunch of names on it of all of the guys from that village who were killed during the First World War. I have a friend who was looking to possibly move to France at one point, and this was maybe 5 to 10 years ago. So he and his wife went to this town. It was in South France somewhere. I can't remember the exact place. But they went and they were looking around, and somebody inquired of them, what it was that they were doing. And they said, well, we're, possibly moving to France, and we're looking at this town. And they were so excited that somebody might be moving to their town because their population still had not recovered from its pre-1914 numbers. This particular village, I wish I could remember which one it was, had been so devastated that, still hadn't recovered 100 years later.
It's mind blowing. I know you've been to Verdun before, and
yes.
I don't know if you went to a little village called Fleury de Vendôme, which is one of a number of them in France. That's a village that was a full functioning village at the start of the war, and today has, if I remember correctly, has 0 inhabitants, but still has a mayor. So there's one. Yeah. There's a mayor of the village, but there's no inhabitants to it. And all you do is, if you walk up what was the main street in the village, you see a little plaque on the left side of the road. This was the school. This was the shop. This was the church. All of it just utterly devastated. And whole communities all across France and Belgium too, for that matter, are just annihilated during the war. And but it's the sons of those villages are the guys on the front line. They're the ones out there fighting, and they're fighting to try and free their own, their own countrymen. So you can understand why they fight hard, and they really do. In fact, you mentioned in that on that caption there, both world wars. They do too in 1940. For every Brit killed in the 1940 campaign back to Dunkirk, for every one British casualty, and Britain's very proud of the Dunkirk evacuation, there was something like 16 Frenchmen.
That is something that I would like to tackle someday, or maybe you. I don't know if you guys have tackled that on Battle Guide or not.
We've actually funny, nice plug. Next Friday, this Friday, we're doing a Dunkirk video. Next one out, yeah.
So I interviewed a 106-year-old French veteran of the Second World War, and in that initial push by the Germans into France, he was captured and taken prisoner. But everybody talks about Dunkirk and the miracle of deliverance and everything like that. Not many people understand that miracle of deliverance had a very high cost, and that there were French soldiers inland who were holding off the Germans so that evacuation could take place. And that's where he was captured and then was held for the duration of the war.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, to go off script slightly, JD, I know we're talking First War, but there's a couple of really powerful things about that. And I think it goes to your question about the French in the war. First one is, for the simple equation that for some men to go home, somebody else has got to stay.
Yeah.
In the vast majority of times, that's French soldiers staying, sometimes always at the cost of their freedom if they're in the northern pocket, and very often at the cost of their lives as well. So, it's British lives are being saved by French people giving up theirs on the battlefield. And to give you an idea of just how hard the French can fight when they get given the opportunity, and there's no doubt there's a rot in the French general staff at the start of the, particularly in May 1940. There's just terrible, terrible problems. But they're not on the fighting front. They're not with the soldiers on the ground. They're with much higher strategic and grand strategic thoughts. But there's only one time in the entire war, to the best of my knowledge, that the Germans offer what refer to as honours of war. That's allowing your defeated enemy to march out of their place, wherever they've been captured, bearing arms, flying their battalion and regimental colours and divisional standards, and they're saluted by their enemy when they do. Wow. Only one time does that happen. It's to the French First Army, who hold out in Lille so the Dunkirk evacuation can go on. And the Germans stand there at attention and let 30,000 Frenchmen march through the city. It's one of the most powerful moments of the whole Second World War.
I've never heard that story.
It's amazing. Yeah.
Wow.
It's really amazing.
I think there's also a bit of a misunderstanding too. If you look just at the Second World War with blinders on, and you don't see anything that has happened before, it's very easy. Again, we're going off script here. We're going into World War II now. But it's easy to look at that and maybe accuse the French of being soft or being cowards or giving up too easy. I don't think people have a full appreciation for the trauma that country endured in the First World War. And if you're looking at going through all of this again, it gives me a little bit of empathy for them, where you're like, man, this country was maybe looking at their own annihilation, and perhaps it's better to go ahead and surrender rather than completely butcher another generation of men and live to fight another day, for lack of a better way to describe it.
Which of course they do, right? And it's if you'll allow me another little anecdote, there's one that springs to mind when you were describing that there. Of course, the French are then under occupation in the north of France from 40 to 44, and under the Vichy regime, and then later occupied by Germany in the Second World War. But there's one account that I listened to on the Imperial War Museum, which got some great sound archive. It was a few years back now, and it was an account of a British SOE Special Operations Executive pilot who was flying in supplies to the French resistance at that time. And he reported, I think 3 nights in a row, he flies out from Tempsford, just near where he used to live, actually, flies across to France, and he tries to find the landing ground, which is supposed to be marked with headlights from a car. Third night he gets there, and he's absolutely furious when he hits the ground, and he goes and shouts at this local Frenchman and says, "Outrageous, I'm risking my life for your country 3 nights in a row, and you only just managed to get yourself sorted out now. You know, this is horrendous." And the interview is with this pilot, and he says, what this Frenchman said next absolutely humbled me. And he said, "Look, let's be clear. You know, I'm the Frenchman that's here to meet you. I'm also the town doctor. I was here last night, must have missed each other. I was here the night before, we must have missed each other. I'm here tonight. I'm working tomorrow, and I've worked all 3 days since then. And if you get shot down on the way here, you get a memorial and a headstone, and your wife gets a pension. If I get caught standing here, I get executed, so do my wife and kids."
Wow.
And he said at that point, he said that particular pilot just said, and never said a single word badly against him again after that.
Wow. So this kind of here, we'll bring it full circle here with World War One. One thing that I've reiterated over and over, because people I've noticed on a broad scale tend to drift more towards World War II history at the expense of World War One. But I've always contended that you cannot fully appreciate and understand the Second World War without fully understanding and appreciating the First World War.
Couldn't agree more. You know, take any major character of the Second World War, with the exception of one, Eisenhower. All of the others, what have they got in common? They all cut their teeth on the Western Front in the First World War.
Yeah,
your Pattons, your MacArthur's, your Montgomerys, you know, good and bad. But they all found their fighting form. They all understood what trench warfare could be like. And maybe, I don't know, mate, maybe that's why we don't see it in the form that we see it in the Second World War. Who wants to go there again?
Exactly. So you have time to tackle a few questions?
Sure.
All right. So here's one. I'll go back to this super chat from Mike. 6 questions, Lentz. Thank you for your discussion today. Have a few questions. Was the war inevitable? And is the inevitable nature of the conflict a myth? Was this thing going to happen no matter what?
I think something was going to happen no matter what. How it actually played out, I think that there was too much at stake in the kind of the rising tensions of powers in Europe in the summer of 1914 for something not to happen. Whether it was Sarajevo that kind of was the spark that lit the powder keg, as they often say, or whether it would have been another event 3 weeks later or a month later or 6 months later, or maybe we would have seen a war on a slightly more limited scale. But, you know, to my mind at least, and I'm no great expert at this, I think it was inevitable that something was going to happen, but maybe not on the global scale that we saw it.
Interesting. There was another question that I'm scrolling. Oh, wait, here we go. Can you speak to anything about the evolution of medical care in the First World War? Are there any changes? Again, back to that guy who gets knocked out and is in a coma throughout the war. Anything different in 1914 versus 1918?
Yeah, I think so. And in a way, medical, in a way, not. It's certainly evolution. That guy that gets hit on the head in 1914 is in a much worse situation because he got a cloth cap on. By 1918, he's wearing a helmet. And, you know, that makes a big difference. That makes a big difference. But let's say he does as well. There's the introduction of what we refer to as the casualty evacuation chain. And along with everything with aircraft and machine guns and gas, that develops astronomically throughout the Great War. So, you know, if you get wounded in 1914, the setup's pretty rudimentary. You know, the processing, you could get treated by a generalist doctor and you could go to various generalist places. But for real treatment, you need to be back in the UK. And so there's a convalescence process involved in that. By 1917, the entire system has been refined. And tragically, it's been refined because there's a hell of a lot of people that need to go through the system. But, you know, the process is now much better. Stretcher bearers are trained to give life-saving, even operations in some cases, on the battlefield. If somebody's bleeding out from an arterial bleed, stretcher bearers now, they're not just carrying people from the battlefield, they're able to stop serious bleeds. Regimental medical officers now are involved in really serious triage. And right at the front line, they're going to be triaging as if you, I, and somebody else comes in. he's going to be looking for 3 categories: will live, won't live, might live. Won't lives, put them away quietly to one side, give them a shot of morphine. Unfortunately, not particularly if you've got a lot of casualties at the same time. It's not worth spending your time on. Will live, they might be screaming their head off with a busted arm or something like that, but they're not the immediate priority. It's the might lives that then go first down that chain of evacuation. And within a couple of hours, they can be at the hands of not only a surgeon, but a specialist surgeon, somebody that deals specifically with head wounds, or somebody that deals specifically with abdominal penetrative wounds. It gets so specific and so precise, but it has to, because so many people are becoming casualties. And, the chance, I think, of if you get to a casualty clearing station, a CCS, about 12 miles behind the lines, your chance of surviving it at that point is about 97%, extremely high.
Wow.
So
wow.
Huge evolution, yeah.
So here's another super chat that just rolled in. Longest lasting battle fought in World War One.
If you take the Battle of the Atlantic, the early Battle of the Atlantic out of it, and the fight that goes on in the Atlantic Ocean with submarines and that kind of thing, to the best of my knowledge, it's Verdun. It's about a year long.
Okay.
Very, very brutal. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking as well. Man, 1916 was just a brutal year, and there wasn't a good year, but man, you take the Somme and Verdun, it's unreal.
Horrific,
to think about what those guys went through. Here's another one from Sander VK History. But he has a good channel. He very close to 100,000 subscribers, by the way. He's like right there. So just a side note, when we're done with this, go to his channel and give him a subscription. All right. So what strategies were used in World War One that are still used in today's warfare? That's a good question.
That's a great question. I mean, there's a number of them that we see. Drones are effectively, if you take away the things like kamikaze impact that we're seeing these days, the idea of just scouting enemy positions and reporting back in real time, that was done with an aircraft, with somebody with a radio, or even dropping streamers over enemy positions 100 odd years ago. It's much smaller. It's much more efficient. It doesn't have a person in it anymore, but effectively the same thing is being done. In the same way that we see scouting into enemy lines, that's absolutely done on the ground. There's no substitute for feet on the ground. And so we see trench raiding on quite a large scale out in Ukraine at the moment, which is something that has to be relearned. It's a lot of stuff that's forgotten and then relearned during that period of time. And so it's just daily trench routine and trench attrition. Even to the extent out in Ukraine at the moment, we're seeing things like morning and evening artillery barrages, which are fairly standard. In the First World War, they're known as being that. They're called the daily hate. Every morning and every evening, about stand 2, there's people firing artillery shells at each other, and it's still going on today. So, if you think about that, and even things like wire cutting. So in order to get into an enemy position now, into an opponent's position, I should say, you've got to cut their wire. We develop on the Western Front something called the Graze fuse that's really efficient at that. And the same kind of munitions developments happening out there at the moment. So to allow various different munition types to cut barbed wire. So there's loads of it. Yeah. I think the big difference, and I say I'm no great expert at this, but the big difference to my mind is you just don't see large troop concentrations anymore. They're almost evaporated from the battlefield. Yeah, company-size attack across the field just don't happen. It's too dangerous.
That's something that I was going to throw in, is that, to my knowledge, World War One, which again, this could maybe have been thrown in as another myth, that all of World War One is everybody going over the top, everybody going across the field in no man's land en masse, and it's just that the whole war. But you're kind of seeing either an evolution or the beginning of small unit actions in the form of these trench raids.
Definitely. Infiltration tactics are really useful. If you can get into an enemy trench and literally what they call bombing along at that time, so throw grenades around traverses and keep pushing away. It takes a hellish brave guy to do that, but it's way safer than advancing across an open field with a machine gun firing at you full chat. So, we see these kind of developments. And by 1918, when Germans bring in stormtroopers, that brings a whole new element, a new style of tactics. And then the Brits and the French, in fact, the French probably more so at the Second Battle of the Marne, they're going to develop similar techniques, and they're going to start getting into enemy trenches, instead of attacking across ground, infiltrate through them, stay in cover. It's very brutal, and it's quite often done at a range of inches rather than hundreds of yards, but it's effective.
Cool. All right. Let's throw out one more. The Canadians and Anzac were usually used as shock troops, like a third EAP or EEPR or EPRA or wipers. Were they proud about this, or was this kind of a dubious honor?
Both.
Okay.
It's and you can imagine it. There's the reason they use the shock troops is because they're really good. The German army in 1918, just before the spring offensive, I think 1st of January 1918, they publish a report, and that report is a review of all British, in inverted commas, so all British and Commonwealth battalions, divisions on the Western Front, and they grade them from 5 mediocre to 1 outstanding. All 4 Canadian divisions, and bear in mind, Germans have no skin in the game about this. They don't care where there's no national pride involved. Yeah. The Germans grade all 4 Canadian divisions as outstanding, as number 1. I think 3 of the 5 Australian divisions are 1s as well. Only a handful of British divisions, the Guards, the 29th, the Royal Naval Division. The only New Zealand division, they're graded as outstanding as well. So, these guys they have a great reputation because they get the job done. This whole idea of I try to use this sometimes on the battlefield, and I hope it makes sense, JD, but the idea is, if you take the Western Front as a whole, there are troops who are static in each area. In fact, the Germans are always static. They never rotate in the same sense. But, 37th Division might hold a particular part of the line between Arras and the Somme. Mm-hmm. They could be there for 6 months. And then if it so happens that an attack needs to come to that area, those troops are included, but so are a load of others that are brought in. It's a bit like a circus coming to your town. The circus arrives, and the circus has got all of the leading shock troops in it. It's got the Aussies, it's got the Kiwis, it's got the Canadians. They arrive, they do the fighting along with the 37th Division who were there in the first place. The battle ends, they pack up, and they move on to the next place, and the 37th stay behind. And that kind of system repeats. So to one sense, clearly they're the best guys for the job. But the second is they get massive burnout as a result. They suffer huge casualties. Man for man, the Canadians, the Australians, and the New Zealanders pull more than their fair share in the Great War. They don't win it, which is sometimes a bit of a on-battlefield argument / joke I have with Canadians and Aussies, but they certainly pull more than their fair share. They do some extraordinary things on the Great War. But it's it's a tough one. What do you think about that?
Yeah, well, here, let me go ahead and just toss this next question up here. I said there was only going to be one more, then this super chat rolled in. That kind of ties in with what we were just talking about. Which nation involved in World War I punched most heavily above their weight? Cheers and thanks. Love your work. Okay, David, thank you for that. Appreciate the super chat there. For me, I'm saying the Canadians. I love the story of the Canadians in World War I. And they were definitely a tough bunch. What would be your opinion on this?
I'm gonna have to do this sitting on the fencing. I don't think I could commit to that one. I would say, there were various units you could throw in. You could throw in North African tirailleurs from the French army. You could throw in Gumiers and Zouaves again from French North Africa, performed really well. South Africans as well. The South African Brigade on the Somme in particular does extraordinary stuff. No, I don't. I'm gonna hedge my bets and say they all did very well. But the Commonwealth, yeah, absolutely. It in general punches above its weight.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, I think that's a good way to wrap it up. I've been seeing a whole lot of comments over here in the sidebar. People have really been enjoying the conversation. If you've enjoyed the conversation, then you definitely need to subscribe to Not So Quiet on the Western Front and also Battle Guide, because, well, you have Dan talking with someone who is much more intelligent than me, and you get some just top quality conversations. Anything before we head out from you? What do you got coming up?
I just want a big thank you, to you and all the people that are tuned in to listen to us have a chat. So yeah, some exciting stuff coming up. Say, doing a little bit of Dunkirk stuff in the coming this week on the Battle Guide channel. Really looking forward to, in about a month's time, going away and doing a big deep dive on the story of the Doughboys, the American Expeditionary Force on the Western Front. So we're actually it's our first one. We're taking a group of Not So Quiet on the Western Front listeners out on an on-the-ground battlefield tour over 7 days. So we're going to Belleau Wood and Chateau Thierry. Spencer and I, my co-host, we're going to be literally taking people on the ground, starting at Belleau Wood and finishing at Henry Gunther's Memorial, who's the last Allied soldier killed on the Western Front at 10:59 and about 58 seconds on the 11th of November 1918. So can't wait for that. A few beers on the battlefield as well. Can never go too wrong.
Oh, brilliant. Well, hey, man, thanks for jumping on here today. I know that you're extra busy right now. So thanks for carving out some time and, helping us learn a little bit more about the Great War.
Pleasure, JD, as always. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you. All right. So there you go. That was a little bit from Dan Hill of Battle Guide and Not So Quiet on the Western Front. Again, would highly encourage you to go and check out both the YouTube channel and the podcast. Again, I don't say this lightly. They are some of my favorite. And also, if you're still hanging in there, about 6 minutes ago, the newest episode of History Traveler just dropped. So you can go over there and check out our next episode, looking at the first commando raid, definitely on Guernsey, maybe in the Second World War, depending on how you define a commando raid. So go and check that out. Be sure to subscribe not only to this channel, but also all of the other history channels and show them some support. So anyway, thanks for joining us today. And yeah, we'll see you in the next one.